Picture this, a long stretch of highway cutting through the darkest part of nowhere. The road ahead is shrouded in a thick blanket of fog, with the dim glow of headlights barely piercing the dense night. On a night like this, the kind of silence that hangs heavy in the air isn't comforting, it's oppressive. The hum of the truck's engine is the only companion, but even that feels distant. It's the kind of night where the shadows on the roadside seem to move, even when nothing should be there. And yet, something was. Something that's haunted truckers' stories for years, whispered in hushed tones at dimly lit diners and truck stops. What one man saw on that road. Well, let's just say, he wasn't driving alone that night. This story comes from a seasoned trucker, a man who spent over 2 decades in navigating the lonely highways of the country, someone who had seen just about everything the road could throw at him, or so he thought. It was supposed to be a routine trip, another overnight haul through an isolated stretch of road. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary, just him, his rig, and the highway stretching endlessly in both directions. But by the end of that night, his world would change forever. What happened on that road forced him to park his truck for good. It was more than just unsettling, it was something so unexplainable, so deeply disturbing, that even other drivers who've shared similar experiences still refuse to talk about it too loudly. This isn't just another story passed around for entertainment. What you're about to hear is true, corroborated by others, and remains one of those moments that lingers in the mind, daring you to explain it away. Imagine being miles away from the nearest town, with no streetlights, no cell service, just an endless ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the void. The air itself feels heavier, almost pressing against you, and every sound seems amplified, a branch snapping, the shuffle of something just out of sight. That's where he was. And when the first unusual thing happened, it was subtle enough to ignore. But it didn't stop there. What started as small, almost dismissible moments escalated into something no one could prepare for, no matter how many miles they'd driven or stories they'd heard. What he witnessed that night on that desolate stretch of highway will leave you wondering how much of the world around us can truly be explained. And as you listen, you might just find yourself glancing over your shoulder, questioning the things we can't always see but somehow feel are there. This is his story. Mike had been driving trucks for over 15 years. He wasn't just another driver, he was the kind of man who thrived on the solitude of the open road. To him, the endless stretches of highway and the rhythm of the engine were more comforting than any busy city street or crowded diner. He had a knack for finding peace in places where most people would feel uneasy, navigating isolated backroads and desolate highways that others avoided unless they had to. His usual routes took him through some of the loneliest, most remote parts of the country, places where cell service was a luxury, and the nearest help was often hours away. But Mike didn't mind. He knew these roads well, especially the one he'd be traveling that night, a stretch of highway cutting through miles of dense forest. The locals called it the Devil's Pass. It wasn't on any map by that name, but every trucker knew the stories. People talked about strange lights in the woods, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, and even the occasional disappearance of a driver who was last seen heading down that road. Mike had heard it all before, but he was the kind of man who dismissed tall tales. To him, it was just another route, another job, another night. That night, the weather was colder than usual. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes the air feel heavier. Fog had rolled in thick and fast, blanketing the road in a damp gray haze that swallowed the truck's headlights. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine, a comforting presence against the suffocating silence outside. It was the kind of night where even the forest seemed lifeless, as if the usual rustling of leaves and chirping of insects had been muted. The road ahead was empty, stretching endlessly into the fog. Mike adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the white lines as they flickered in and out of view, but there was something about that silence. It wasn't just quiet, it felt unnatural. The kind of quiet that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, even when you don't know why. Mike shook off the thought and focused on the road. After all, he'd driven this route a dozen times before without incident. Tonight would be no different, or so he thought. For the first hour, everything about Mike's journey felt routine. The familiar rumble of the engine, the rhythmic bounce of the truck over the uneven highway, it all seemed to blend into the kind of hypnotic calm he had grown accustomed to over the years. The fog outside thickened, swallowing the world beyond the glow of his headlights, but Mike barely noticed. To him, it was just another quiet night on the road, nothing more, nothing less. But then, something caught his eye. In his side mirror, just on the edge of the fog, a pair of headlights appeared, small, faint, and distant at first. He assumed it was another vehicle, maybe a late-night traveler or another trucker making their way down the same lonely stretch. The light stayed steady for a while, always at the same distance, neither gaining nor falling behind. Mike didn't think much of it at first. Highway driving meant long stretches with little variation, and it wasn't unusual for vehicles to linger in the distance. But when he glanced again a few minutes later, the lights were gone. Completely. There was no sign of a vehicle turning off or slowing down, no faint glow of taillights fading into the fog. They had simply vanished. He brushed it off as a trick of the fog or his tired eyes. Still, there was something about the way the lights had disappeared that gnawed at the back of his mind. He adjusted his mirrors and focused on the road ahead, telling himself not to let his imagination wander. Then came the first thud. A sharp, heavy sound against the side of the truck, like something solid had hit it. Mike's hands tightened on the wheel, his eyes darting to the mirrors. Nothing. Just the fog swirling against the dark outline of his trailer. He let out a slow breath, chalking it up to debris on the road or a stray branch caught in the wind. But then it happened again. And again. Each thud louder, more deliberate, like something, or someone, was trying to get his attention. Mike pulled over onto the shoulder, his headlights cutting a narrow path into the void. He stepped out cautiously, the cold night air biting at his skin. Walking around the truck, he checked every inch of the trailer and the cab. Nothing was out of place. No dents, no scratches, no sign of what might have caused the noise. Yet, the uneasy feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. As he climbed back into the cab, the CB radio crackled to life. Static hissed through the speaker, broken by faint, almost inaudible whispers. He leaned forward, adjusting the dial, trying to make sense of it. The whispers grew louder but no clearer, their tone sharp and urgent, like a warning spoken in a language he didn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the radio fell silent. Glancing into the mirrors again, Mike thought he saw movement, quick, darting shadows that seemed to dance along the edges of the trailer. He squinted, his pulse quickening, but when he turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Only the empty highway and the fog pressing in on all sides. The silence inside the cab was deafening now, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. He reached for the CB radio again, his hand trembling slightly, but before he could speak, the static returned, louder this time, and with it came something new. A voice, low and distorted, speaking his name. Mike's heart raced as he stared at the radio, his mind scrambling for an explanation. He told himself it was a coincidence, that he must have misheard. But deep down, he knew better. Something wasn't right. And as he shifted the truck back into gear and pulled onto the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Mike pulled into the truck stop, his headlights illuminating a scene that looked like it hadn't seen life in years. The place was desolate, as though it had been forgotten by time. The parking lot was cracked, with weeds sprouting through jagged crevices. Two other trucks were parked on the far end, their drivers nowhere in sight. To the left, a gas station stood with its neon sign sputtering weakly, casting erratic shadows across the empty forecourt. Beside it, a boarded-up diner leaned to one side, its once bright lettering faded and peeling. Mike shut off the engine and leaned back in his seat, letting out a weary sigh. It wasn't the kind of place he liked stopping, but he'd been driving for hours, and fatigue was beginning to take its toll. As he sat in the cab, the silence around him felt heavy, almost unnatural. Even the usual hum of crickets and distant nocturnal animals seemed absent. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he stretched and scanned the area. The air was cold and damp, the kind that clings to your skin and makes you shiver without reason. He thought about heading to the gas station for coffee but paused when something caught his eye. There, just beyond the glow of his headlights, stood a figure. It was hard to make out any details in the dim light, but it was tall and unmoving, positioned unnaturally still. Mike called out, his voice echoing into the emptiness. No response. He took a cautious step forward, his instincts urging him to stay alert. But as he approached, the figure vanished. Not into the shadows, not around a corner, it simply wasn't there anymore. A chill ran down his spine, but Mike brushed it off. He wasn't the kind to let his mind play tricks on him, and besides, he was too tired to dwell on it. Climbing back into the cab, he locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and settled in for a quick nap before hitting the road again. Just as he was drifting off, a knock on the window startled him awake. It wasn't a polite tap, it was loud, insistent, almost frantic. His eyes darted to the passenger side window, but no one was there. Another knock, this time on the driver's side. He turned quickly, his breath catching in his throat. Nothing. The parking lot was empty, save for the two trucks in the distance. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the air feel suffocating. He tried to convince himself it was the wind or a loose branch, but deep down, he knew better. And then, faintly at first but growing louder, came the sound of laughter. It wasn't joyful, it was low, guttural, and carried an edge that made his skin crawl. It seemed to come from all around him, circling the truck, moving closer and closer. His hand instinctively reached for the ignition, but before he could turn the key, something appeared on the windshield. A face, distorted and almost translucent, pressed against the glass. Its features were twisted, its eyes dark voids that seemed to stare straight into his soul. Mike froze, his mind racing, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the face was gone, leaving behind nothing but the faint outline of condensation where it had been. Mike didn't wait to see if it would return. He started the engine, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. The laughter outside faded, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As he sped out of the truck stop, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw the figure again, standing in the shadows by the boarded-up diner, watching him drive away. Mike's hands trembled as he turned the key in the ignition, desperate to leave the truck stop behind. The engine coughed and sputtered but refused to start. He tried again, pumping the gas pedal, muttering a shaky prayer under his breath. The truck's headlights flickered weakly, casting brief glimpses of the empty lot around him, but no comforting roar of the engine followed. Outside, the air felt heavier, oppressive, as if the darkness itself was pressing against the truck. Mike's eyes darted to the mirrors, scanning for any sign of movement. And then, in the faint glow of his cabin lights, he saw it, a figure standing just a few feet behind the truck, still and silent. It wasn't moving, but there was something about its stance, the way it seemed to lean slightly forward, that filled him with a deep, primal fear. He tried the ignition again, this time with more force. The engine sputtered once more, then roared to life with a deafening sound that almost made him jump. Relief washed over him for a brief moment, but when he looked back at the mirrors, his blood ran cold. The figure was closer now. It hadn't moved, not in any way he could see, but it was closer. Slamming the truck into gear, he pressed the accelerator, the tires crunching over the gravel as he sped out of the lot. The neon lights of the gas station blurred in his peripheral vision, and the boarded-up diner disappeared into the fog. But even as he left the truck stop behind, the feeling of being watched stayed with him. He glanced at the rearview mirror, and there it was, the figure, standing motionless in the middle of the road, its shape growing smaller as he drove further away. Just as he began to convince himself it was over, something caught his attention. In the side mirror, faint but unmistakable, were the same headlights he'd seen earlier in the night. They were distant at first, just two small dots in the sea of darkness, but they were keeping pace with him. He pressed the accelerator harder, the engine groaning under the strain as the truck surged forward. But no matter how fast he went, the headlights stayed the same distance behind him, unyielding, unrelenting. His pulse quickened as the headlights suddenly disappeared, leaving only the dense fog in his mirrors. He exhaled shakily, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. But before he could find any comfort in their absence, they reappeared, closer this time, brighter, as if the vehicle behind him was accelerating far faster than it should have been able to. Mike's breathing was shallow, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the hum of the engine. He flicked his high beams on, hoping to cut through the fog ahead, but the road stretched endlessly in front of him, offering no sign of a turnoff, no sign of escape. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the headlights behind him vanished once more. Mike blinked, his eyes darting between the mirrors, waiting for them to re-emerge. But this time, they didn't. The fog around him seemed to thicken, the darkness pressing closer, and the silence inside the cab grew deafening. He drove for what felt like hours, his eyes darting nervously to every shadow, every flicker of light. When the fog finally began to thin and the faint glow of a distant town appeared on the horizon, he felt his body begin to relax. But just as he let out a shaky sigh of relief, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. The figure. It was there again, standing on the side of the road, its head tilted slightly as if watching him pass. It didn't follow, didn't move, but the sight of it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. Mike didn't slow down, didn't dare look back again. He kept his foot on the accelerator until the lights of the town enveloped him, the distant hum of life finally replacing the oppressive quiet of the highway. Even as he parked the truck and stepped out into the safety of the town, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. And deep down, he knew he'd never drive that stretch of road again. By the time Mike reached the edge of the small, bustling town, the sight of streetlights and the glow of storefronts felt almost unreal, like stepping out of one world and into another. The faint hum of distant cars and the muffled voices of people going about their lives brought him a sense of relief so profound he had to sit in the cab for a few minutes, just breathing. For the first time in hours, the silence that had surrounded him on the road was gone. But the unease clung to him, a weight pressing on his chest, refusing to let him believe that the nightmare was truly over. When he finally stepped out of the truck, his legs felt shaky beneath him, his body heavy with exhaustion and tension. He made his way to a nearby diner, its fluorescent sign buzzing softly in the night. Inside, the warmth and chatter of other patrons enveloped him, but even as he sat at the counter, the feeling of being watched lingered. He told the waitress he needed to use the phone, and after a few confused looks, likely because of his pale complexion and trembling hands, she pointed him toward a payphone near the restrooms. Mike dialed the number for the nearest highway patrol office, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He tried to explain what had happened, his voice cracking as he recounted the events of the night. The officer on the other end listened in silence, the occasional sound of pen scratching paper breaking the stillness. When he finished, there was a pause, then the officer sighed. "You're not the first to see them on that road," the man said, his voice low, almost resigned. Mike felt his stomach drop. The officer didn't elaborate, didn't offer any explanation, but the weight of those words hit him like a freight train. Later, as he sat nursing a cup of coffee, another trucker slid onto the stool next to him. The man was older, his face weathered and lined with years of experience. He'd overheard part of Mike's conversation, and after a few moments of silence, he began to speak. "They call it the dead man's stretch," he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Been like that for years. People go missing, rigs are found abandoned, and no one has an answer. Some folks say it's the fog. Others say it's something worse." The trucker shared a few stories of his own, drivers who swore they'd seen lights in the woods, figures standing by the side of the road, and heard voices that didn't belong to anyone visible. He spoke of disappearances that had never been solved, accidents that seemed to have no logical cause. Mike listened in stunned silence, his coffee growing cold in his hands. For the rest of the night, the stories played over and over in his mind, blending with his own experience until he couldn't tell where his memories ended and the truckers' tales began. By the time dawn broke, painting the town in soft hues of orange and pink, Mike had made up his mind. He couldn't do it anymore. The open road, once a place of freedom and solace, now felt like a trap, a place where the rules of reality bent and broke in ways he couldn't understand. He left the trucking industry within the month, selling his rig and taking a job in town that kept him far from highways and desolate stretches of road. But even with the change in his life, the memories never truly left him. Every now and then, he'd hear a sound, a knock on the window, the hum of an engine, and he'd find himself back on that foggy highway, heart pounding, expecting to see that figure staring back at him. And though he never drove that road again, he couldn't escape its shadow. The stories followed him, whispered among truckers at diners and rest stops, growing more vivid and unsettling with each retelling. And every time he heard them, he felt the same chill crawl up his spine, a reminder that some roads should never be traveled after dark. And so, Mike's story ends, but the questions it leaves behind are anything but resolved. A journey that began as a simple overnight halt turned into a descent into the unknown, a collision with something that defied explanation and left its mark on him forever. Think about it, the unrelenting fog that seemed to swallow everything around it, the mysterious figure that appeared without moving, the guttural laughter circling his truck, and the face, twisted, unrecognizable, yet undeniably present. These are not things easily forgotten, and for Mike, they were enough to change the course of his life. But what about the others? The drivers who've shared similar accounts, the locals who whisper about disappearances, the investigators who arrive too late, finding nothing but empty rigs abandoned on that desolate stretch of road? It begs the question, what truly lingers in the shadows of the dead man's stretch? Some would argue it's nothing more than fatigue playing tricks on the mind, a phenomenon born from the isolation and monotony of the road. Others insist there's something more, a force, a presence, waiting for those brave or unlucky enough to pass through at the wrong time. And then there's the history, the rumors of a road cursed by the tragedies it's witnessed, by the lives it's claimed. Whatever the truth may be, that stretch of highway remains active to this day. Truckers still drive it, some unaware of its reputation, others cautious but willing to take the risk. And yet, if you were to ask those who've experienced its peculiarities, they would all tell you the same thing: avoid it at all costs after dark. So now I ask you, what do you think Mike encountered that night? Was it something paranormal, a force beyond our understanding? Or could there be a darker, more human explanation for the fear that grips anyone who drives that road? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this send shivers down your spine and leave you questioning the world around you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Join us next day for another tale that will keep you awake long into the night. Until then, drive safely, and maybe, just maybe, think twice before taking the shortcut through the dead man's stretch.